Hello, and welcome to a bonus box of Warhammer 40k's Grim History from the Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and today we'll be going to talk about my favorite Tau in the Milky Way system, Commander Farsight.
Now last week, when we left off, Envy had proclaimed Commander Farsight to be the hero and leader of the Tau Empire's military forces. Leading the largest force ever assembled by the Tau Empire, Farsight set sail back into the Damocles Gulf to reclaim the worlds they lost to the Imperium of Man. During the hours of the journey across the Gulf, when he was not in stasis, Farsight gathered every action report and drone-captured snippet he could lay his hands on from the War of Delaith. With the help of Commander Brightsword and his old ally, Ovessa, Oshova gradually built up a comprehensive picture of Imperial war doctrine. Day and night, he pored over how the armies of humanity acted and reacted in different situations and theaters of war, how they made planetfall, what it took to provoke them, and most importantly, what it took to break them. There were elements of the Imperium's armies, notably the Hammers of Dorn, whose adherence to a set of methodology was almost fanatical. Such was the diligence and precision with which they observed their military doctrine that, in studying them, Commander Farsight was able to write down their tactical imperatives as a set of commandments. By the time his coalition had crossed the Damocles Gulf, Oshova had pieced together much of what he and his lieutenants referred to as the Human War Schematic, a code that he believed the Imperium's troops observed at all times. In doing so, he learned a good deal about the blind spots in the Tau's traditional military doctrine, and began to adjust his repertoire of strategies to compensate for these oversights. Ironically, Farsight had pieced together a military doctrine put into creation by an even grander strategist, the Primarch Rabute Gilliman. That's right, folks. Commander Farsight was smart enough to actually document by sight the Codex Astartes, the space book of the Adeptus Astartes. As the Tau arrived once more on the far side of the Gulf, Farsight used his newfound knowledge about the Imperium to dramatic effect. With the bulk of the Imperial military in the sector pulled away to engage Hive Fleet Behemoth, Commander Oshova found himself waging a series of campaigns in which he held the advantage from the start. Over and over again, Oshova's foresight paid off, and the Tau Empire rejoiced with every new conquest. Through a combination of military acumen, hard work, and verve, Commander Farsight had lived up to the inflated claims the Ethereals had made in his name. World by world, battle by battle, the Damocles Gulf was brought back into the fold. Yet, the reconquests of the four principal worlds on the distant side of the Gulf were bloody in the extreme. By the time the fleet had reached the last system of the previously colonized region, there were fewer than half of the original ships remaining. Oshova felt every loss keenly, not merely as a military setback, but as an emotional and spiritual wound. His ethereal advisors had made it plain that there would be no more reinforcements, not this far from the Empire. Unfortunately, the Tau were not the only ones to have taken advantage of the Imperium's armies being withdrawn. By the time the coalition arrived, the asteroid belt to the east of the Enclaves was infested with orcs. The Tau fleet mounted a series of swift raids to repel the orc raiders from their recaptured territory, each one successful and efficient. However, as space-capable drones made their flyby scans, the horrible truth became clear. Almost every asteroid large enough to hold them was teeming with orcs. And if the fleet's readings were correct, the asteroid belt was but the tip of an empire that stretched all the way into the next star system. The Farsight expedition was on the brink of total victory, but the orc presence disturbed Oshova greatly. He meditated upon the new information for many hours, and upon returning to his ship's command bridge, he gave an order that would shake the Tau Empire to its core. He announced that the destruction of the orcs was a higher priority than concluding the reconquest. He would expend every effort to exterminate them, targeting every planet that they had infected in this system and the next. It was the first time a Tau of any rank had disobeyed a direct order from the Ethereal Council. Oshova's decision was an unthinkable breach of the chain of command. For the newly claimed Farsight Enclaves, it was only the beginning. As the other cast of the Farsight expedition began repopulating the Enclaves, Oshova's fleet was readying for war. Leaving only a small garrison to defend the colonies, Farsight set out for the Vorak asteroid belt to clear it of orcs. His plan was for the Tau Navy to use their superior range to pick the orcs apart without risking a single life. Though the concept was sound, Farsight's plan soon faltered. Long-range scans betrayed an incredible truth. The asteroids were not hiding the orc fleet. They actually were the Orc fleet. Gigantic clumps of debris had been sheathed with scrap metal and weapons, with crude engines the size of biodomes attached at the rear. Extremely vexed by this revelation, Farsight formulated a meticulous plan to exterminate all the Orc asteroid ships. With Admiral Kor-O-Li Mao Tang's finest pilots at the tip of each spearhead, the Tau fell upon the clumsy Orc fleet with dizzying speed. Each asteroid could barely turn its gun towards the Tau before its engines were blown apart by the aircast. This spectacle was repeated for weeks, and Farsight's progress could be followed by the string of burning lights he was stitching across the stars. Yet, the sheer number of the Orc bases was their only real defense, though the now accepted tactic of killing the Orc leader and throwing his followers into anarchy was next to impossible to enact. Furthermore, whilst Farsight was methodically smashing base after base on the fringe of the Vorak belt, hundreds of the first asteroid ships were accelerating towards the worlds of the next system. Once most of the Orc asteroid ships had been destroyed or driven off, Farsight reported to his trio of ethereal advisors that the Greenskin menace was greatly reduced, and he could dispatch a full half of his fleet to return to the Enclaves. They nodded sagely, but as Farsight was about to leave in triumph, they had something to reveal. Admiral Kor-O-Li Mao Tang had been killed by a hidden missile base whilst overseeing an extermination order. Farsight's eyes narrowed for a moment, but he bowed low, asking for leave to go to meditate in his quarters. When he emerged, however, his resolve had hardened once more. The fleet would not be returning. Not yet. The Orcs would be pursued, and every last one put to the torch. Unbeknownst to Oshova, his strike into the Vorak belt had initiated war against a foe who had not only fought against the Tau before and survived, but who had come to understand the Firecast in turn. Grog Ironteeth, war chief of Atlanta, had learned the hard way that the Tau could outrange the Orcs in space, so he planned to draw them away from the Enclaves and engage them at close range on the most rugged and congested planets he could find, with plenty of cover and lots of hiding places from which to start what he thought of as a proper fight. The remaining asteroid ships of the Vorak belt spread out into two fleets as they neared the Magi system on the fringes of the Damocles Gulf. Farsight's armada monitored them as best they could. One cluster plunged towards the deserted world of Arthas Moloch, and the other towards the Tau-held planet of Atari Vo. A large dagger-shaped asteroid flew at the heart of the latter fleet, and after meditating on the anomaly, Farsight concluded that the flagship shaped like a weapon would appeal to an Orc leader. He gave the order to head to Atari Vo, and his assumption was correct. The dagger asteroid was indeed his quarry's flagship. Signaling the Tau who had settled on Atari Vo in the Second Sphere expansion, Farsight prepared to make planetfall and join with the planet's Firecast against the imminent Orc invasion. The Atarian Tau and their Delithian reinforcements were still scrambling their own fleet to engage the asteroids when they received the chilling message from Farsight's fleet. The asteroids would not be slowing upon entry. The Orcs intended to smash them into the planet with as much force as possible. It was as the same as Arcanusha, only this time the target was a world of cities and gardens instead of a planet-sized desert. At first, the Tau were confused by Farsight's presence on this side of the Damocles Gulf and refuted his claim. But as the asteroids hurtled down, the truth became horribly clear. They slammed into the planet's main continent, Volhaya, each one snuffing out millions of lives with its impact. The dagger-shaped flagship at the heart of the fleet drove itself deep into the capital city, Tau Rota Shah, jewel of Otaria Vo's white-walled cities. It was reduced to a blasted crater in the space of a few seconds. The surviving Tau hoped that the Orcs had died executing their insane tactics, but they were horribly disappointed. Protected by powerful shield cores in each warship, the Orcs seethed out of the wreckage in a storm of aggression. Farsight's armies docked in the planet's sky stations and joined the battle unfolding on the planet below. But it was soon clear that they were fighting a very different breed of Orc from the primitives they had encountered in Arcanusha. Hulking leaders in glyph-covered greatcoats, unleashing blasts of blinding green fire from their multi-barreled guns, each powerful enough to punch clean through a battlesuit. Captured hammerheads and sky rays lurched from the rocks, plasma fire splashing from their steel-fanged hulls as they plowed into the ranks of their former owners. Whirring Orc coptocraft spat hails of fire, forcing the Tau into cover as yet more Orcs spilled from the breach. At dozens of impact sites, the battle intensified again and again, until Tau blood mingled with the blackish ooze of the orc fallen amongst the rubble. Salvation was finally delivered, not by the Firecast, but by their Aircast brethren. Whole shoals of barracudas and tiger sharks were dispatched, their advance preceded by waves of piranhas, mowing down mob after mob of skulking orcs with their burst cannons. With his foe on the run, Farsight pressed the advantage, leading a cadre of his own warriors over the lip of the dagger's ship's impact crater and falling upon the orcs below. Only then did the true cunning of Grog become clear. Thousands of orcs spilled into the crater and fell upon Farsight's force, like the jaws of a vice. The Tau could not fire in every direction at once, and they were swamped within a few minutes of the trap being sprung. The last stand became a massacre as a hulking, ostentatiously dressed war boss flung himself into the fight. His mind churning with emotion, Farsight ordered his battlesuit teams to boost out of the melee with their jetpacks. They fired into the orcs below as they soared away, felling a great many with their parting gesture, but the fact remained that they had charged headlong into a trap. Those Tau who had escaped reconvened in the sky stations, conceding the battle zones around each asteroid and laying plans for a planet-wide counterattack. Humbled by his defeat at the crater, Farsight acted only as an advisor as the ensuing war unfolded. He risked his life over and over again to atone for leading so many to their deaths, but the stain on his honor remained. The planet's military isolated and eventually destroyed the orc invaders over the course of a difficult and costly campaign. When victory had been assured beyond all doubt, Farsight left Atari-Vo, swearing not to make the same mistakes. Yet in his introspection, he had underestimated the cunning of War Chief Grog once more. When Oshova's fleet emerged again from the Damocles Gulf, they were shocked to find the Farsight Enclaves in a state of full-scale war. Panic rising within him, Farsight ordered his fleet to close on Vior-Los, most populous of the worlds, and long-range communications confirmed Oshova's worst suspicions. Those scattered asteroid ships that were not destroyed had fallen from the skies above the vulnerable enclave planets. Much like before, the asteroid ships had been used as weapons. The night skies now empty, where the necklace of asteroids had glinted before. With the majority of their military on campaign, the garrisons defending each world were locked in a desperate battle for survival. Farsight met with his commanders at the new Firecast headquarters, a giant disk city hovering in relative safety above Vior-Los's ocean. The situation was much the same on the neighboring worlds of Luprecal and Tenekla. Even the ocean world of Salasheh was prowled by iron-hulled orc battleships. The Greenskins were running riot throughout the enclaves, and the Firecast had already made plans to withdraw the survivors into evacuation zones. His voice level and controlled, Oshova asked how they could have let events get to this point. They reported that the war had hung in the balance, until a great orc potentate appeared and united the armies. Since then, they had lost territory fast. The warlord Farsight had hunted all the way to Atari-Vo had seemingly escaped, only to double back and strike at the vulnerable enclave worlds, whilst their commander was busy elsewhere. Ordering his lieutenants to remain behind and fight in his stead, Farsight strode quickly out of the Firecast High Command, climbing into the command cradle of his XV-8 Crisis battlesuit, and took off towards the horizon. Months passed, and the war for the enclaves ground on. Though Oshova's armies were led capably by his lieutenants, without their leader, it was all they could do to hold the seething hordes of orcs back from total victory. Murmurs of dissent and even anger began to spark in the corners of the enclaves with Oshova's disappearance. Appalled by his own failings, Farsight resolved to think long on the events that had led him to this point. There was no victory in fighting a traditional war of mobility and patience. The orcs were on the brink of bringing the enclaves to total ruin, and were so intoxicated by the sense of imminent victory that even killing their warlord would not stop them. Farsight sought insight into how he could bring the planets themselves to their aid as he had done in Arkonasha. Yet this time, the scale of the war was much greater. In his search for wisdom, he skimmed low across the saline oceans of Vior-Los, and then plunged into the water, diving down into the darkness of the ocean bed. In the next few days, the commander meditated on what he should do, seeking the elements of the world as guidance. He started with water, then the winds, earth, and finally fire. After he settled his mind on that final element, his eyes opened and he shot off like a rocket back to his people to join the fight. Over the next few weeks, there came a series of dramatic turns in the tide of war for the Farsight Enclaves. Above the crystal plains of Tenekla, elegant Tau fighters had dueled for weeks with thousands of snub-nosed orc aircraft. Commander Farsight suddenly joined them out of nowhere, ordering every aircast pilot in the skies to override their consoles and release their propellant gases, forming a wall of volatile emissions shaped in his specific instructions. Then he ignited it with a blast of his plasma rifle. A great gale of flame roiled out across the plains. As they burnt the last of their fuel to escape, the Tau aircraft were buoyed by the resultant thermals and rode the thunderhead of the titanic fireball, whilst the clumsy Orc aircraft were consumed behind them. In the process, the surface was simultaneously scored clean of both greenskins and their corrupting spores. On the watery world of Selashahe, Commander Farsight dove once more to the bottom of the ocean and carefully planted the gifts he had requested from the Earthcast. His old friend, Ovesa, had not let him down. The dull thumps of the disc-shaped seismic fibrillator nodes awoke the wrath of the world's oceanic vents. Soon the seas above were riven with such extreme tsunamis that the Orc battleships prowling its waters were all capsized. The razor whales of the ocean ate well that night, but Farsight had already moved on. The earthen landscape of Luprecal was next. The Earthcast had built hundreds of oval living nodes upon the planet's surface, each nestled safely between the planet's towering spires of rock. The Orcs roamed Luprecal in their billions, besieging every last node, and the Tau were beginning to starve. Farsight ordered the entire fleet of Tanakla to enter extreme low orbit and mag-lift the nodes to safety. Then Oshova dropped a clutch of Ovesa's seismic fibrillators into Bokal, the Great Abyss. Before the hour was out, the planet shuddered in protest, and every one of the delicate rock spires collapsed, burying the Orc hordes in 40 meters of solid rock. The mag-lifted living nodes were lowered back down to sit atop the world's new crust. They were restored to full productivity within the week. Lastly, Farsight returned to his adopted world of Viorlos, where his first act was to conduct a mass Telesaria bonding ritual, revitalizing the frayed morale of his warriors. With the other Enclave worlds freed from the invaders and the cast united behind him once more, Oshova enacted a mercilessly efficient military strategy that culled the Orcs from one district after another. He then used powerful artifact firestorms to sterilize the environment. Very few indigenous species survived the extermination Farsight unleashed on the planet, but no Tau were lost in the flames. As his chillingly effective methods burned the Orcs from the Enclaves, Oshova's one concession to his own desires was the isolation of the Orcs' leader, Grog Iron Teeth. He finally located the war chief in the eye of the firestorm, attacking his own followers in an attempt to restore order. It is said that Farsight bested the beast in single combat, though none were there to witness it. All that remains of Grog is the sparkling globe filled with ash, the name of each of the Enclave worlds engraved upon its surface. Though Farsight had won a series of great victories and restored himself as the hero of the newly fortified colony worlds, the green screen threat was still not ended. Where the Orcs of the galaxy hear word of a good fight, their tribes and clans travel to the site purely to start the fighting all over again. The Farsight Enclaves would battle the Orc menace time and time again, most notably at Arthas Malak. Now this is most notable not because of Farsight's vengeance upon the Orcs, but what lurked in the 8-pillared temple known as the Great Star Dais. As Farsight mopped up the remaining Orcs in the temple, something bizarre began to happen. Wherever an Orc fell in battle, a bizarre explosion of light spilled out. Farsight watched in fascination, as eventually a blazing disk of multicolored light began to form above the dais, the shadows of the milling Orcs beneath it dancing with life of their own. A sudden gout of energy poured out of the disk like blood bursting from a dying man's lips. When its glow faded, the star-carved stone was covered with horned crimson aliens, the likes of which Farsight had never seen. The long-limbed creatures cut into the Orcs with swords so black they seemed to Oshova like holes in space. More gobbets of energy spilled out of the blazing disk, and dozens of bright pink figures cartwheeled and capered out from wherever they touched. Raising their comically long arms to the skies, they sent blazing streams of multicolored fire into the Tau observers above. Flames that turned the prow of the passing piranha into shards of kaleidoscope glass, and flames that turned Tau to stone, to water, to statues of screaming bone. Farsight ordered the retreat, commanding his forces to fall back into the skies as quickly as they could. Oshova himself was the only one to look back. As he gazed down into the crackling disk that whirled above the dais, the portal gazed back, though he knew that to be impossible, growing larger and larger until it filled his vision completely. It seemed to him that some titanic void, A rip-in fabric of reality, of mind-boggling scale, had torn the heart out of the galaxy. Within it writhed the trillion terrible deaths, each calling out to him by name. In that moment, Oshova was changed forever. He had beheld a danger far greater than that posed of the races of Reckon, orcs, or even humans. This disk of light was a gateway to another dimension, and that dimension was desperate to break through. As blood began to trickle from the Shoahei between his eyes, Oshova lost consciousness. His battlesuit spiraled down to crash headlong into the cobweb tomb, its automated system providing just enough intermittent support to prevent him lapsing into a coma. Now, as you probably already figured out, Farsight had run into a hole in the warp, and the strange creatures were in fact demons. Keep this in mind because it will change Oshova's life forever. When Farsight came to, he found that his unconscious form had been retrieved to the med bay of his flagship. The situation on Arthas Malak had gone critical, his advisors reported. Although there were Tau still planetside, they were preparing to evacuate. Drawn by the lure of battle, the orcs were rushing in their thousands to the site of the Great Star Dais. Fortunately, the orcs were throwing themselves into a fight with the mysterious red-skinned aliens that had appeared there, and driving themselves ever closer to the extinction in the process. Farsight countermanded the orders given in his absence. The Tau would not evacuate, he said. They had somehow caused this strange nightmare to awaken, and it was their duty to end it. The ethereals attached to the council nodded their approval, insisting that they must personally monitor the new threat they had uncovered. Their instructions given, the Firecast girded themselves to return to the Great Star Dais in force. Squadron after squadron of Orca dropships descended into the shattered amphitheaters and mausoleums ranged around Arthas Malak's great temple, as mantas dropped hunter cadres into the orc-infested necropoli of the hinterlands. A large detachment of Tau had been tasked with monitoring the strange creatures spilling from the rift, whilst two other major detachments eradicated the remaining orcs at as extreme a range as possible. The seething melee that had started upon the Great Star Dais was heaving back and forth as more and more orcs joined the fight. As Farsight and the ethereals came within scanner range, a pair of massive red-winged creatures, twice the size of Farsight's battlesuit, burst out of the disk in a blaze of red light, hurtling through the skies directly towards them. Behind them came more winged beasts, some feathered in the manner of Violan rocks, some with bat-like wings that drizzled gore on the combatants beneath. These airborne terrors split off into two groups that headed out into the wilderness. As they winged through the sky, they roared and shrieked in a language that Oshova could not even bear to hear, let alone translate. His broadside teams were the first to open fire at the winged monstrosities swooping towards them. Heavy rail rifle fire slammed into the ornate brass armor of the leading monstrosity, tearing off a wing and sending it wheeling to the ground. Seeker missiles and plasma bolts were added to the fusillade, and the second beast quickly diverted around an ancient temple, lost from sight. Suddenly, a third winged creature burst through the crumbling facade to fall upon the fire warriors hiding behind it, the giant alien's brass axe cutting several Tau in half with every swipe. The second of the giant beasts dropped down from above, its clawed feet kicking Farsight backwards into the ruins of the ancient statue. A shot from Oshova's plasma rifle caught it under the chin, sending it reeling backwards for a moment before its curling whip lashed out and ripped an arm from his crisis suit. The battlesuit's directional scans picked up a weapon shaped behind him. The sword clutched by a statue his fall had toppled. Farsight darted behind the statue's rubble a split second before the beast's axe smashed the marble figure to powder. The statue's curved blade fell free. Rolling sideways, Farsight snatched the sword up in a smooth motion and swung it hard at the beast's midsection. The creature easily evaded the blow, launching itself up into the air and bounding past his position. As Farsight pursued the beast, he saw it bring its axe down into a nearby fountain with an overhead blow of such power that Oshova could hear the sharp crack of the flagstones beneath. A moment before Farsight caught up with it, the beast bounded into the sky and swooped off into the distance. Fighting the urge to continue his pursuit, Commander Oshova sent the command out for all remaining forces to rally at his position and re-establish a battle line. Many of his fire warriors were dead, slain by the capering beast that had spilled from the portal, but his troops had died nobly, fighting to the last, and the battle was still raging. It was a gruesome sight that greeted him at the sight of the beast's last attack that made Farsight's throat tighten in panic. Ethereal Onlos had been cut in two from crown to groin, gore spurting into the fountain around him as the limp halves of his frail body twitched their last. A great keening cry went up from the Tau establishing the battle line as the news of the Ethereal's death spread through the ranks. Farsight fought to restore order, issuing a series of clipped commands to hastily reform his teams into fighting strength as he sought to make sense of the jumbled and confused transmissions, interrupting broadcasts across his comm-webs. A great number of the brightly colored creatures had driven the second battle group back with their strange spectral flames, but for some reason they gave a wide berth to one of the worn-down statues east of the dais. The Tau took the opportunity to regroup under its shadow. Meanwhile, the Ethereal that had joined the third battle group, on Daim, had been gored to death in an attack by a giant vulture-like creature. Farsight's warriors were in disarray, trapped with orcs on one side and the unidentified alien creatures on the other. The Tau warriors were on the brink of panic, for the more they shot the creatures down, the more of them appeared. It was almost as if each kill caused 2 more beasts to replace those that had fell. Tapping into the visual feeds of the battlesuits in the second group, Farsight examined their environment, and the cadre's miss was a great robed statue, a strange hexagrammatic medallion brandished in its grip. Something struck Farsight as odd about this symbol. For one thing, when he looked at it, the pain that had flared in his head seemed to subside. Acting on instinct, Farsight ordered his warriors to retrieve the hexagram from the ancient statue and carry it forwards against the flamed beast. A few tense seconds passed before the breathless report came back that the multicolored aliens were falling back before it. Ondam's leaderless cadre adopted the same tactic after finding a medallion of similar nature at their own rally point. It seemed as though it would take more esoteric means to defeat this new and inexplicable foe. Farsight took a moment to think on the words that Puretide had taught him upon the peak of Mount Kanji all those years ago. To secure victory, the wise must adapt. Ordering all 3 battle groups to converge on his position, Farsight rearranged his battle plan in an instant. The fire warriors and the support teams would engage the orcs, forming a periphery around the Great Star Dais that would not be breached under any circumstances. The crisis teams would alone engage these new foes at the crackling disc itself, and the hexagrammatic medallions would be brought to Farsight wherever they were found. Above all, he ordered, no blood must be spilt on the dais. If a battlesuit pilot was hit, he must withdraw immediately. Farsight's warriors were perplexed by their orders, but they carried them out to the letter nonetheless. Oshova and his battlesuit cadre stormed the Great Star Dais, as his fire warriors kept a defensive perimeter so that no more orcs could reach the fight. Flamer-armed crisis teams burned the remaining greenskins that still fought upon the dais to a crisp, darting out of reach of the crimson-skinned aliens whenever they came close. As clouds of fire washed across the ground, the blood that covered the flagstones dried and clotted to a crusty film. A howl of dismay sounded from the strange crimson-skinned creatures, reaffirming what Farsight had suspected. The beast needed blood to survive. A warning echo across the dais from Commander Brightsword. He had spotted a trio of massive winged beasts plunging out of the skies. They each had their axes raised as they dove with reckless momentum, straight for Oshova himself. Commander Farsight raised his captured blade high in salute before flicking it outwards, and the hexagrammatic medallions that hung loosely around it sailed in a lazy arc towards the crackling disc in the center of the dais. A moment before the winged beasts fell upon Oshova, the medallions passed into the blazing energies. A tremendous backblast boomed out of the portal, knocking every fire warrior in Crisis battlesuit into the dust. As they gradually helped each other up out of the rubble, they saw the skies were clear, and every single one of the rift creatures had disappeared without a trace. In the wake of the strange battle, Farsight and his warriors purged the ruins of the remaining greenskins. No victory shouts were heard, no warrior vows rang out. Instead of celebrating their double victory against the creatures infesting Arthas Moloch, the Tau returned to their fleet in silence. The last of the Ethereals had been found, headless, surrounded by his unconscious bodyguards. All 3 Ethereals were gone, leaving the Tau bereft of guidance. The Enclaves had lost all their spiritual leaders in a single tragic battle. Oshova could not shake the feeling that this had been no accident, that some unfeasible force had conspired against his people by killing the Ethereals. Though all of his training formidable intellect railed against it, the visions he had seen in the crackling portal stayed with him night and day, infecting his thoughts with ever more dangerous conclusions. There was more to the universe than progress, unity, and destiny. Something lurked behind the material world, something foul, hungry, and immeasurably evil. Upon the return of Farsight's expedition, the tragedy that had unfolded on Arthas Moloch rippled throughout the Enclaves. Though the Tau had known doubt before, the death of all three of the expedition's ethereals cast billions of souls into confusion and angst. Word had spread of the strange entities the Farsight cadres had fought on the artifact world, but in the minds of the Tau Citizenry, the Malachites were a dangerous new race of aliens and little else. Oshova, for his part, held suspicions closer to the truth, that the grotesque creatures were not of the physical dimension at all. For there to be another reality that ran parallel to the material universe explained so many things. The rift creatures appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye on Arthas Malak, the blazing storms of light that had spat out the human fleet during the Makli's Gulf Crusade, and the strange deities of humans and orcs and the seemingly sentient rust devils of Arcanusha. Furthermore, if it were possible to somehow travel in this alternate realm, an empire need not know the limitation of time or space. With the benefit of hindsight, it was clear that the expedition's ethereals already knew something of the existence of such things. Yet they had long hidden the truth from their people, choosing to keep them in obedient ignorance. Though he dared not speak it openly, subversive ideas had sprouted from the seed of bitterness in Farsight's heart. Perhaps the caste would be better off seeking a natural harmony, thought Oshova, without the ethereal caste moderating and controlling them at all times. Their actions in the past had bordered on despicable. Their war crimes and cold-hearted politics had seemed necessary and wise at the time, but now, in retrospect, were exposed as deplorable. It is said that Master Anva was able to convince any Tau he spoke to of the justice of his actions, no matter how drastic. Was it possible that the ethereals had been influencing the other castes through some means other than logic and loyalty? The more Oshova thought about it, the more he recalled incidents where Tau had acted with unnatural obedience in the presence of the ethereals. Even the fundamental myth of Phaeton, where the ethereals appeared from the stars to broker peace between the warring castes over the course of the single night, spoke more of an external force acting upon Tau society than an internal resolution. Heresies reeled through Farsight's mind, taking him to the edge of panic. For him to reveal these terrible truths would shake the Tau Empire to its core. Or still, in all likelihood, they would bring about the Montau, the time of horror, all over again. Yet the secrets were of such magnitude that putting them to the back of his mind and continuing to lead his people was impossible. With a sickening lurch of thought, Farsight realized that the most dangerous threat to the Tau Empire was himself. Leaving his battlesuit behind for more devoted champions to use in his stead, Oshova fled into the searing wilderness of Iorlos' plains, exiling himself to a twilight existence of arid caves and dust, with nothing but his own dark thoughts for company. Now, it is here where we see a huge difference between Horus and Oshova. While Horus took his despair and anger in being betrayed by his leader, the Emperor, and turned it into hatred and contempt against the empire that he had so long stood for, Horus did what most of us would have done. I could see the thought now. You betrayed me? Fine. I'm going to get you back. Revenge is the name of the game, sir. Vengeance shall be my force, and I shall rain retribution on you, no matter the cost, father. And yet that was what the Horus heresy was. The Emperor finally poked the wrong bear, and Horus rose up in a hateful wrath, and all hell followed with him. Yet, we can see how wrong he was, because, in the end, Horus didn't get his revenge, and worse, the Imperial man has suffered. His people have suffered ever since. Even worse, those that followed Horus, his brothers, were damned to the whims of the Chaos Gods, and are still under their oppression, as well as their own hatred to this very day. Farsight, on the other hand, did something rather remarkable. He could have led his Tau back into the Empire and unleashed retribution. Yet he hesitated. His hesitation wasn't because of fear for himself, it was what he knew what would happen to his fellow Tau. A rebellion against the Tau Empire would cause untold innocent deaths, and that was something he couldn't do. His fellow Tau stood in the way of his conquest, so what could he do? He takes a beat. Now, I will say for a leader, this was not the greatest idea. In fact, foolish. He did what most of us would do if we weren't hell-bent on retribution. He ran away from his problems. Both the choices of Horus and Farsight at this particular junction are enacted out of fear. Horus's fear was being forgotten, because after the Great Crusade was done, the Emperor had no need for him anymore. And anyone who knows the Emperor knows what that means. Just look at the Thunder Warriors. And so Horus turned his fear into wrath, and all suffered because of it within the Imperium. Farsight's fear was what he would do if he returned, starting a rebellion, and so he fled. One son started a war, the other one ran away from his problems. Neither are great answers to fear, yet one does have a way back. Farsight takes some time to figure out what he's going to do, and in the end, it pans out. For now. But let's get back to what's going on in the Tau Empire, shall we? Now, back on the Tau core sept worlds, they heard progressively less from the Farsight expedition as the years wound on. Soon the probes sent across the Damocles Gulf failed to reappear altogether. Commander Farsight, whose natural lifespan was long spent, was officially proclaimed dead. The entire Tau Empire mourned the passing of their mightiest hero and the end of his glorious quest to bring the light of the greater good to the distant stars. The truth was to come to light some decades later, when an Outrider probe's routine orbit led it past the Farsight Enclaves and back to the sept worlds at the Empire's core. Instead of being barren of Tau life, the colonies were flourishing. They had clearly found their own way in the galaxy, independent of the commands of the Ethereal Council. Even their sept colors and symbols had changed. Anva was furious. The Ethereal's white-hot anger at Farsight's desertion cooled into a cold fury that was far more dangerous. Since Anwei's passing, Master Anva had become the supreme ethereal in his stead. He used every bit of his influence to destroy the hero he had created all those years ago. He informed the council of the probe's findings, insisting that Oshova was a dangerous rebel, a rogue influence whose heresy should be condemned in the most public way possible. All images of Farsight were to be destroyed, all monuments to his glory reduced to rubble, and all mention of him erased from history. The entire area of space on the far side of the Damocles Gulf was renamed the Forbidden Zone, off limits even to the most senior of Tau. All across the Tau Empire, Oshova's supporters were forced into hiding. Those who spoke well of him were taken away for sessions of questioning, from which very few emerged. Only upon his home planet of Viorla did a few images of Farsight still linger, for the commander still had many supporters on that world. To destroy all sign of his presence would risk a dangerous backlash that Anva, even in his anger, was wise enough to avoid. Instead, the Supreme Ethereal allowed a single statue to be left standing outside the battle dome of Montir, repurposing it from a glorious monument to a grave reminder that without the guidance of the ethereal caste, even the finest mind could be turned from the light. On the far side of the Damocles Gulf, the Farsight Enclaves continued to forge their worlds to better suit their own destinies. Yet, with their leader missing for so many years, they too had begun to see Oshova as a distant memory. Generation after generation was born, lived briefly, and died out. Over 100 years passed without a sign. As time marched on without him, Commander Farsight became little more than a whispered myth. As 997.M41 drew to a close, long-range reports of a strange galactic cloud reached the fringes of the Enclaves. It fit no recognized energy patterns until Commander Arakhan, who had been a wise military leader to the Enclaves for many years, correlated with the recent data fed to him from hidden allies in the core septs. Silence fell over the Firecast High Command when they saw what the abnormal readings represented. The tendrils of a Tyranid Hive fleet heading right at them. The Tau had learned much from their 2-year war against Hive Fleet Gorgon earlier that century. The Tyranids were a foe like no other, able to adapt and spawn at an appalling rate. It was imperative that the Splinter Fleet snaking towards them be taken apart before it made planetfall on any of the Enclave worlds, or their swarms might spell death for every living dwelling there. The aircast fleets from each of the Enclaves were mobilized to intercept the Hive Fleet, and led into space by Admiral Koro Kai. Fighting bravely for 6 weeks, it was all for naught. There were simply too many Tyranids to stop. 3 out of 4 of the bioship clusters were set upon and destroyed, but as the aircasts were fully engaged, the 4th cluster entered colony world space above Viorlos, with relatively little opposition, as the skies grew sick with the Tyranids' pre-invasion corruptions. The desert vegetation swelled and bloated. A hail of mycetic spores began to rain down from the Splinter Fleet above. Longer lived than any Firecast warrior before him, the hermit Oshova watched the skies turn purple-gray above his desert refuge. The cacti and creepers that had provided him with water grew out of control into horrible new shapes. Something was attacking his world, something that was changing the substance of his home to better suit its purposes. Oshova could only think of one reason why an invading entity would boost the amount of biological matter on the planet before it attacked, fattening it like a Grok's calf intended for a feast. The invaders were coming to feed, and he knew that his people needed him more than ever. Amidst the terror and desperation that erupted across the Enclaves, a note of joy rang out on Violos. An old dark-skinned warrior had walked into the great Violos Museum, claiming to be Farsight, the famous hero of old, and demanded his revered battlesuit be returned to him, submitting to the required genetic tests with dignity and determination. Sure enough, Oshova had returned to them in the hour of their greatest need. The Firecast took great heart as a living legend emerged from the desert to guide them. They had soon redoubled their efforts to hold back the Tyranid swarms, infesting the Violos plains. Studying every scrap of information his commanders could supply about the Tyranid race, Oshova coordinated a new war effort that hinged upon aerial supremacy. A mass spearhead of 80 crisis teams engaged every winged Tyranid they could find, to the exclusion of all else, tearing them out of the sky with long-range missile fire while staying well away from the swarms below. Once they were sure of their aerial success, the fire warriors of Violos boarded the anti-grav docking pontoons that Farsight had requisitioned from the planet's orbital stations and used them to skim across the seething plains. Wherever larger Tyranids were found, they were engaged and destroyed by volley after volley of pulse rifle fire from the anti-grav pontoons. In this matter, Oshova intended to break the Tyranid's leadership structure in a worldwide killing blow strategy that destroyed the mind links coordinating each brood into a coherent invasion force. At first, the strategy seemed sound. The Tyranid leader beasts were killed, leaving their forces directionless. Unfortunately, the enemy was quick to adapt to this strategy, and the losses proved so great that Farsight abandoned the plan. They would need something new. Calling an emergency council, Farsight convened with the greatest minds of the Enclaves. His old friend, Ovesa, was still clinging to life by virtue of a cocktail of age-regressive drugs of his own invention. He suggested that if the art of the killing blow was not working, then perhaps the patient hunter might be given a chance. Farsight's brow wrinkled, but he gave the idea full consideration nonetheless. Their world was ripe for the plucking, on the brink of being devoured by the Tyranid hive fleet above. As horrifying a notion as it may seem, perhaps they should not try to prevent the attack. Instead, they would allow it to happen, and then strike back. The very next night, Farsight and his 7 most trusted commanders escorted Ovesa to Violos Earthcast research facility, File-Rotul, deep in the Valley of Dust. Given enough time, the ancient scientist believed that he and his colleagues could develop a countermeasure that could destroy the Tyranids before their final triumph. Oshova knew that this was their last chance. With his planet all but overrun, he gave the order for the rest of the Tau upon Violos to evacuate. Before the week was out, there was only 12 Tau left on the entire planet. Farsight and his 7 battlesuit commanders, Ovesa, and 3 Lubgral's most capable Earthcast. Using samples of Xenos biomass gathered from the battlefield, the veteran scientists worked night and day to develop a biological countermeasure. Their research facilities guarded by 6 XV-8 crisis battlesuits, an XV-88 broadside battlesuit, and one of the few XV-104 Riptide battlesuits that had been accidentally diverted to the Farsight Enclaves from the ships en route to the Mugloth Bay campaign. Though Oshova had deliberately kept the facility's defenses as small as he dared in order to escape detection, on the 8th day, the swarms found them nonetheless. Thousands of scuttling weapon beasts poured through the gullies and valleys from every direction. Blade-limbed colossi stalked in their midst. Farsight relayed his greatest of respect to his honored comrades and prepared to give his life to buy Ovesa a few more precious seconds. The battle that unfolded between battlesuit commanders and the Tyranid swarms was the stuff of legends. Oblatai 9-0, the XV-88 broadside battlesuit, operated by the AI Engram of Farsight's old team leader, bullseyed dozens of Tyranid leader beasts from the vantage point atop the research station. Commander Bridesword's fusion blades blazed bright as they cut through the giant battering ram monsters that assailed the gates. Alien ichor evaporating into choking clouds around him as he felled one, boosted away, and then slashed through another. Wise Commander Oricon molded complex firing solutions to defend every new ingress, coordinating the Flamer Blast from Commander Shovastos and Commander Torchstar to consume the greatest number of the lesser weapon beasts wherever they scuttled through the rock. When a towering monstrosity killed Shaso Varga with a blast of bioelectricity, burning him to death inside his Riptide, Commander Bravestorm charged underneath the Tyranid Biotitan's midsection, powering his ancient Onager gauntlet to maximum. Bravestorm punched out its thorax in a gory salute to his fallen comrade. Meanwhile, Farsight dueled with the hissing leader beast at the swarm's heart, matching the dawn blade against the hive creature's crystalline swords. Even Ovesa was able to join the fight at the last, remotely accessing the interface of the fallen Riptide and bringing his weapon systems back online in order to deliver the death blow to a squat-bodied brood beast that was birthing lesser Tyranids straight into the facility's corridors. Suddenly, a great cloud of dust whirled up, obscuring the combatants as a Manta missile destroyer, Horus Luprecal, hovered above them. Ovesa signaled to Farsight that he had summoned the Aircast's finest to extract them. The deed inside the facility was as good as done. One by one, the battlesuits boosted up into the air and boarded the Manta. Below them, the research facility was buried under leaping Tyranid bodies as the Tau made their escape. Of the brave Earthcast scientists, only Ovesa survived. Over the course of the next few cycles, the world Vorlos was stripped bare of every last shred of biomass. The ribbed mouth parts of the hive fleet had descended to feed, hungrily sucking down the rendered-down gruel of their conquests from the many digestion pools below. Farsight and his commanders monitored the vile spectacle from high orbit. As the twin flames of grief and anger twisted in his gut, Oshova began to doubt the course they had chosen. When he cast a questioning glance across to Ovesa, the wizened scientist just smiled and pointed back towards the bioships themselves. Farsight saw nothing at first, but soon a black stain began to spread across the chitinous flanks of one of the Tyranid vessels. Within a matter of only a few moments, the affliction had spread to a second ship, followed swiftly by another, and then another, until none were free of the malign tendrils. The bioship shuddered and wreathed as the discoloration blossomed outward to cover them entirely. One by one, the fleshy Tyranid vessels fell into themselves, rotting and falling away like a piece of fruit, decomposing in a matter of seconds. Before the hour was out, the bioships had disintegrated entirely. You see, the countermeasures the Earthcast had made, explained Ovesa, had been a suite of self-replicating poisons. The necrotizing agents had been on a time delay release in order to ensure that they were fully taken inside the hive fleet before activating. The vector of transmission had been the bodies of the Earthcast scientists themselves. They imbibed the poisons as their last act upon Vorlos. Once their bodies were broken down into the digestion pools, the bacterial nodes that they had locked within themselves infected the air itself. As Ovesa had hoped, the Tyranids had even stripped most of Vorlos' atmosphere away to fuel their further conquests. In doing so, they had doomed themselves to a swift and painful death. The last act of the Earthcast scientist had moved Farsight on a deep level. Here was the true expression of the greater good, not in clever politicking or waging war, but in self-sacrifice, so that others might live better lives in their stead. Though he was used to the warriors of the Firecast laying down their lives in the name of the Tau Empire, to see such selflessness in another caste humbled him. The deaths of the scientists had ignited a flame of ambition in his heart once more. Oshova strove to see Vorlos rebuilt and resettled. Its three principal cities, named for the Tau scientists that had given their lives so that the rest of the Enclaves might live. The barren wastes and volcano rages would be rebuilt as Tau cities that boasted many grand monuments. On Luprecal, the favored planet of the Earthcast, field after field of white oval memorials were laid in the name of all those who had given their lives to the greater good.
And so, no longer would Oshova shy away from his destiny as a leader and hero. The fight must go on.
Now, as far as I know, Oshova still leaves the Farsight Enclaves, and while this last chapter of his life took kind of a dark turn, he still seems to be fighting the good fight and protecting his people from the darkened horrors of the galaxy. I wish to thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this Vox. Feel free to like, follow, subscribe, and comment. And if you really like our stuff, go ahead and hit the join button to support us as members. Have a great day, and as always,
Until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.